Hello and welcome to Broken Entertainment, and I have previously discussed how the comic book industry is dead, and I have also talked about DC being in deep trouble and probably closing within a year or two, and now we have evidence that that is accelerating. So this was reported by Ethan Van Sciver and your boy Zach, and it's up here on Bleeding Cool, but it looks like people might be probing DC for buying their IP for individual characters. Now, if the company was doing well, if they were in good financial standing, none of this would be even close to a rumor. And it kind of reminds me of when Marvel had issues in the 90s and went bankrupt. But more than that, we know that DC has fired a vast majority of its staff. We know that DC has cut down to 30 some odd issues. They've got a couple of decent Future State comics going on, and reportedly those sales numbers are up. But at the end of the day, they're a struggling company owned by a company that is $100+ billion in debt. And that company has multiple times fired huge portions of their staff. So DC is not healthy. And what makes Warner more money out of DC? Do they make more money publishing comics? Or do they make more money licensing out the IP? And we've talked about this before as a possibility. The thing that would make sense to me is if Warner license out the properties to Boom Studios, to IDW, places like that that are willing to publish other people's characters and have a good track record of doing so. And then they make the money doing that. They make residuals potentially off of the comic books, and of course they can still own the characters to make million, 100 million, 500 million, $1 billion movies off of them, depending on how well they do. And we know also, of course, that they want to keep these properties because they are currently pushing HBO Max really hard, and everything under the sun is connecting HBO Max and various DC Comics properties as potential TV shows or movies. So I think there's a pretty good chance this is a where there's smoke, there's fire situation. But let's go ahead. We're not going to get into the whole article because he spends most of the article blathering on about unrelated topics. But here it is. Last year, a number of high-rolling individuals were given tours of DC Comics Burbank with AT&T Warner's officials. As a result, there may be some new options, because Bleeding Cool has been made aware of plans by big-time DC comic fans with access to a lot of money, many millions from across many businesses. A collaboration of some of the biggest cheeses who, with a combination of personal wealth and raised capital, are making an approach to AT&T. Not to buy DC Comics outright, not to touch the movies, the TV, the games, or the merchandise, but solely the rights and ownership of the comic book side of the publisher. To be able to create and publish the DC Comics line as they would like, let Warner's do the movies and TV shows, but take all the cumbersome work of actually publishing comic books off their hands, while Warner is free to adapt as they wish. If you could be a member of this group, you have already been approached. People who can bring or can raise a minimum of 8 figures apiece, who have built both an Action Comics #1, Detective Comics 27 to spare, do really, really, really like DC Comics. The fans are taking over Arkham Asylum. We don't have enough information to really say whether this is true. But we do have enough information to glean that it probably is. Does that mean that it's going to happen? No, not necessarily. But when when companies in general, particularly companies that own valuable properties, begin to kind of circle the drain, you start to see people with money come in and start quietly talking to them about acquiring some of it, because people like that like to invest in new properties, they like to make money, they see valuable assets available, but they have no interest in the decaying company itself. Given what we know, DC Comics is in a really vulnerable position. It's very, very likely that people with money have approached AT&T and Warner and said, hey, I want to buy Batman. I want to buy Superman. Or in this case, I want to publish the comics, but you own everything in terms of the IP. That kind of scenario is a win-win for AT&T Time Warner. They can unleash portion of their debt by selling this off. They don't have to deal with an industry they don't really understand in terms of comic book publication. And they retain the rights to the movies, the TV shows, the computer games, etc. So, I think very likely this is going on. I think it's very likely within a year we'll hear more specifics about what's actually going on. But it is absolutely another sign that DC Comics is going to, at the very least, change dramatically within the next year or two. If people are willing to buy it and continue its publication rather than spinning off the IPs to other publishing companies, then you'll still see it around. But the question then, of course, is if these people buying it are actually capable of running a publication company. But ultimately, I can't say whether it would be a good thing or a bad thing for the characters and for the comics because we have no idea who any of these people are. On the face of it, it's a good thing because DC has not been able to handle these characters. DC has been screwing up routinely over the last 5 going on 10 years. And new blood, people who are interested enough to spend millions of dollars on comic book publishing, could bring some new life into it, particularly if they're people who understand comics or are willing to hire people who understand comics. So, we'll see where it goes. Definitely worth keeping an eye on, though. And again, even the rumor existing is another indication of the state DC Comics is in, and it's not good. So if you liked the video, hit the like button. If you're not subscribed, consider subscribing. Hit the bell for notifications, and I will see you next time.